What makes FE world building good is an interesting question to ask, and I think the best way to answer it is to first figure out what makes an FE world bad. And surprisingly, the answer of what makes world building bad differs quite a bit from other ways in which a media property can be poorly written. For example, if you want to explain why a character is bad, you can point to an unsatisfying character arc, bad dialogue, or maybe just being flat out offensive. Or if you want to criticize a story, you can point out unnatural plot devices, bad pacing, or plot holes. However, world building is a bit different, and I think the best way to describe this is to point out the most infamous of FE world building criticisms, which is that the continent of Fates doesn't even have a name. And the reason I find this interesting is because it's not criticizing something that exists, it criticizes something that doesn't. This, interestingly enough, makes good world building a lot easier to criticize than bad world building, because if a story has bad world building, there's only so many ways you can say that the information needed simply isn't there. Yet both poorly thought out information and a lack of information can lead to the same consequences, which are disappointment, or even worse, confusion. For part of world building is knowing when and how to present information, with said information ideally being spread out naturally through the main story instead of being only in a timeline, which may not even be in the game. So what information is needed to create a good world, and how should this information be presented? Moreover, how do we create good world building, specifically in Fire Emblem? Well, today I will be answering that question, so sit back, enjoy this video, and hopefully you will learn something. Part 1. Geography. Well then, let's start with what makes up geography, because while a lot of it is rather obvious, some of it is not. Geography includes the landscape of the main continent, any use of alternate dimensions, and any animal in the environment, including monsters which are not made by humans. So let's begin by talking about the continent, starting with its shape, because remember, it is seemingly the smallest of details which determines how good the world building is. For if the continent is too jagged, just looking at it can confuse the audience, and for me at least cause a headache. Yet if the continent goes too far to the other extreme, the map will look like a brick, which makes it boring and can cause the countries to blend together, so a balanced map is necessary. Speaking of which, map design in Fire Emblem and in a lot of video games is much more important than in your average fantasy book, where a map is just used as a reference in the back, or in a TV show/movie where you are lucky to see a map at all. For in a lot of video games, the map will be shown between every level, making it much more relevant and thus much more important to get right. Now, in Fire Emblem, there are two main kinds of maps, each which have their own advantages, as world maps allow you to walk over them, leading to better immersion with more intricately designed geography, and static ones which look like the typical maps in the back of your fantasy novel that tend to have better markings for borders and capitals, as ink-esque writing allows for a clarity that cannot be transcribed onto a world map. While Fates is the only game that uses neither type of map, instead opting for you to select a glowing white light that represents each chapter. This is easily the worst map, as you will never remember what the glowing white light represents, and the flat, mostly green background adds more confusion than clarity. This means that the map from Fates lacks the most important aspect of map design, which is clarity. To give another example of how confusing a map can be, let's look at the one from Phoneland, which as opposed to Fates gives too much information, with the excess of names being too squished and small, as well as the font being too hard to read and lopsided, so someone who has no knowledge of Phoneland would be unable to say, "Find the capital of Adrestia." Still, to give this map some credit, it does have clear borders, and not having borders is one of the most common ways that Fire Emblem maps tend to confuse the players. Now this is one of the advantages of static maps, as they are very easy to draw borders on, even if not every static map takes advantage of this, for oftentimes the maps are zoomed too far in, so the viewers can't see the borders clearly, but to be fair to the Game Boy games, due to the handheld size, showing a full map would be unrealistic, so when entering each nation, the viewer will be shown its borders, but to not be fair to the Game Boy games, the viewer will have to remember what the border is and jigsaw the continent together in their mind, which requires quite a bit of concentration and can be quite confusing. So sometimes world maps can actually encapsulate borders better. For example, despite the fact that no lines are drawn onto Engage's map, I can still tell where the borders in Ilios are located. Due to the continent being split up into the Dragon Island, the grasslands, the mountains, the deserts, and the snowland, which makes sense as countries do tend to be divided up based on natural borders, I also want to say that world maps definitely can handle geography better than static ones, as the player can hike up into the mountains themselves, which is a level of immersion that the triangles on static maps simply cannot replicate. For Engage has honestly convinced me that world maps have the potential to be better than static ones, even if that kills the nerd part of me who enjoys fantasy maps to say, because world maps can create better immersion into the environment while still allowing for clear borders. I think the only part of Engage's world map that could really be improved is the lack of the named capitals, as while the cities are marked due to chapters taking place there, something I have noticed is static maps are far more likely to name towns and cities than world maps are, due to it being easier to mark names with ink-esque writing than with chapter titles. However, even outside of naming issues, most world maps do not live up to their potential, as 3 out of the 5 world maps insist on being a boring brown color, and the reason maps are often that color in real life is to help display the ink markings, so by trying to look like typical static maps, they don't lean into the strengths that only world maps have, which is color and dimension. For these allow the audience to get a better view of geography by showing grasslands, volcanoes, and streams in much more detail. So here is hoping that maps will use the Engage model to display better geography going forth. That said, geography is not limited to world maps, as you can also see it on playable maps as well, whether it be in mountains, snowlands, or deserts. However, I feel the biggest issue playable maps have with geography is they tend to blend together, as the player is overwhelmingly fighting on green grasslands. Now, the obvious way to fix this is to have more map diversity, like have more maps on beaches or top rocky islands or in rainforests. That would be great, as long as these maps do not have any annoying movement inhibitors. I also think not having literally every first Fire Emblem country be a grassland would be nice. I mean, let the starter country be associated with snow or mountains before moving on and more evenly spreading out different types of environments so grasslands are not so dominant. The other thing you can do to differentiate these locations are color changes. For example, the western islands of Alib have a distinct fall aesthetic with the orange colorings, so why not have more maps that use fields of colorful flowers, or bright red deserts, or black mountains full of colorful minerals, just anything to make the maps feel more distinctive. Speaking of which, there is the matter of landmarks, with things like mountain ranges or rivers being included. Now, I do not think the games consistently put enough focus on these landmarks, but some, like the Soothsire Mountains and Cuckoo Caves, do a good job of showing why these places are so feared, while others, like the Valley of Torment in Furland, have interesting lore, as it was supposedly created due to the goddess's rage at humanity's corruption, or the location feels important to the plot, like Serena's Forest. The problem is that memorable landmarks are rare in Fire Emblem, with there only being like 2 or 3 per game if you are lucky. despite the fact that only one chapter is really needed to build up a landmark, and I just wish each game had more of them. Another aspect that feels underutilized in Fire Emblem are the animals, and while in more recent games you can look at them outside of battle, in most entries they only really exist as mounts, with normal animals like horses existing alongside the more mythical Pegasi and Wyverns. I also wish Fire Emblem would have more fantasy creatures and also go deeper with more bizarre fantasy beasts, like let's have Yales or Bukavox in these games. Also related to this topic are monsters, which not every Fire Emblem game has, and while not a necessity, they can definitely add to the experience, but too often I find there to be too many humanoid monster designs, or that the monsters just kind of look like big gray blobs. Yeah, I definitely don't think a lot of these designs translated well into 3D and NES graphics, which is why I think the best examples tend to come from Sacred Stones, with its hellhounds, medusas, giant cyclops, and even the more traditional zombies just look better here. With the different monsters being spread out across the game rather well, and it feeling like you fight a wide variety of monsters, many of which have creative and unique designs. This leads to something which I have been trying to talk about throughout the latter half of this section, which is creativity. And here's where I want to give credit to Fates and the country of Vala, which basically looks like a city in the sky, but is located at the bottom of a dark ravine. And because this is a fantasy series, Fire Emblem could do a lot more stuff like Vala. For I think it would be cool to have forests of whistling trees that change colors, pillars of scarlet sands that ascend into the heavens, and mountains of reinforced gold which are covered in black snow. Then imagine these locations being full of giant land-dwelling sharks that can wreck houses, birds with giant metal rings that can light a blaze, and giant tigers which are capable of tearing rifts in space-time. However, if that sounds a bit too wacky, we can always use the fact that Fire Emblem is a multiverse to explain things, which is an extremely underused factor of its world building, as we only really get to see how characters change because of the alternate dimensions they are from, while the idea of showing unique geography in these said alternate dimensions is rather underexplored. So why not have a DLC or mainline game where the characters go to a dimension where everyone lives underwater, or one that is styled like a black and white film noir, or a dimension where everyone lives on Mars. For uniqueness and creativity is what I truly desire from geography, and it is what I desire from Fire Emblem's world building in general, as a country is made up of more than just its geography, which leads us to the next section. Part 2. Government. Government includes the nations of the world, their politics, and the people in charge of each country. Each continent is split into multiple nations, with even the most basic things, like the number of countries, being important to get right, as having too many or too few can lead to issues. Let's start with low numbers, which is far less egregious of the two extremes, and can actually work to some degree, as Valentia only has 2 countries, but the theme of the prosperous land that has become corrupt versus the barren land that has become cruel is a pretty engaging concept. However, after spending so much time in Valentia, the world building can feel a bit boring, as instead of a deep dive into the 2 countries and their relationship, it feels like you are not learning anything or are given information at such a slow pace that it is unsatisfying, when the viewer could be exploring new countries with new leaders, governments, and cultures, which kind of makes it feel like your time is being wasted. Even worse, though, is having too many countries, as most of these nations will feel rushed and underdeveloped. The continent of Archanea is probably the worst offender of this, as it has 10 different countries to explore, with every nation outside of Caledon and Archanea blending together, which at worst causes the reader to be confused about which country they are in, or what is the point of a nation. I mean, they cut PR fee from Effie free, and you probably didn't even notice. On the other hand, a continent can have a good number of countries but still muck things up with bad pacing. Now, it makes sense that the most developed countries will be the ones the good and bad guys are from, but sometimes these screen time ratios can be way off. Tellius is a good example of why this can be a problem, as out of around 60 chapters, only about 5 are dedicated to Goldoa, Kilvas, Phoenicis, and Gallia, while around 55 are dedicated to Benion, Crimea, and Dane. This leads us to see very little of the Laguz nations, when we could have spent more time exploring their culture, showing what their government is like, and explaining how their society functions free from Bjork rule, because as is, most of the Laguz storylines take place in Benion, which helps develop Benion into a really interesting country, but comes at the expense of the Laguz nations, which the story should have really put more time into developing. So then, how does Fire Emblem develop a country? Well, let's start with environment, as one of the most reoccurring Fire Emblem tropes is that nations with harsh environments tend to form harsh governments, as these countries are often home to mercenary forces or need to conquer other nations for resources. Now, personally, I can see why this type of country is so reoccurring, as it is a good way to create conflict with a concept that makes for a more memorable country than generic monarchy number 35. Yes, unfortunately that is my main problem with Fire Emblem governments, as a lot of Fire Emblem countries are just generic monarchies, or feel too much like generic monarchies, yet a lot of continents have a country or two that sticks out as different. This includes Caledon with its magical pontifexes and the history of its founding by Goto, Ragnaferox with its rulers being determined by which champion of the two Khans wins in a fight, and the Lycian League with its city-states that are loosely united together. The Lycian League also leads us into another important way to make a country more interesting, which is conflict between its leaders, as despite being united in theory, some of the leaders of Lycia fight for the bad guys out of their own self-interest, or because they were deceived, or due to them just being that racist. Another example of how to do internal conflict well is with the Benion Senate, as Senaki is constantly fighting against the senators who want power for themselves, but also smother her with false praise to hide their intentions. Still, I feel that conflicts within a country are dramatically underused, as these examples are the exceptions rather than the rule. As, again, unique governments are rare, with most just being generic absolute monarchies. This leads me into another way to make nations feel more unique, which is to shake up the amount of power each king has, ranging from an absolute monarchy to pretty much just being a figurehead. But while there are examples of Fire Emblem toying with this idea, they are rare, and honestly, I think one of the easiest ways to explore this idea is to just have a constitutional monarchy, and that is something Fire Emblem has never done to my knowledge. Now, the reason why absolute monarchies are so present in Fire Emblem, outside of them requiring a lot less effort to make, is probably to create more threatening villains and to put the full weight of the Lord's country atop their shoulders. However, this means that the main characters do not interact much, if at all, with the internal conflicts in their nations, as we see no opposing factions of lords or stalling bureaucrats or any check to the king's authority. The most we get is a strategist questioning the main character's judgment, but there is never a serious conflict between the parties, and there is no true internal opposition to the Lord's decisions. So while I understand why Fire Emblem wouldn't want to get bogged down by 30 different levels of bureaucracy, I also think that a country's internal conflicts can add to a story, with these limitations enhancing a character's struggle and giving the main character new opponents who are hopefully at least sometime portrayed in a more nuanced light. However, even if internal political conflicts are not present in the main story, they may show up in supports. Good examples of this are George talking about the conflicts between Arcanea's 5 noble houses, or Diamond talking about how certain nobles in his country desire him to be more warlike. One problem with these supports, though, is that while I do think it is alright to have some information be support only, I think it would be better if these conflicts were at least hinted at in the main story and then expanded on in supports. Another issue is that supports about a government's different political factions are rare, and I would bet the average Fire Emblem game has more supports about cooking than ones that talk about the political disputes within a government, despite the fact that in my world-building biased opinion, these tend to be some of the best supports in the game. Now, while internal conflicts between those in power are rare, some Fire Emblem games will attempt to talk about classism, i.e., the conflicts between those in power and those without power. And the reason why I say attempt is, yeah, Fire Emblem has never handled classism well, in the main story at least. For example, Almond Echoes is constantly talking about the benefits of merit, but he is only allowed to lead the deliverance because he's Myson's, air quotes, grandson, and rules Rigel because he is Rudolph's actual son. Fodlan's attempt to handle classism through Crest is also poorly done because no commoner actually matters to the story, and pretty much every case of a crest negatively affecting someone's life has to do with a noble. Then Act 2 of Radiant Dawn kills any credibility the Tellius duology had on classism due to the common people who rebel against Alencia being presented as violent idiots for not believing Alencia is actually a good person. However, that doesn't mean there are no successful ways Fire Emblem has implemented talking about classism. They just do not show up in the main story. For while there are definitely supports that don't handle classism well, there are also some that do. Maribel has a lot of good supports that address her classism by showing how condescending towards, air quotes, lowborn she is, but also presenting Maribel's genuine desire to help the common people rather well, with Maribel pointing out how the rich and poor are given unequal treatment by the law, and saying how she wants to become a judge in order to change things. Still, it is not lost on me that the way in which Fire Emblem presents nobility makes it hard for a proper critique on classism, as with the exception of Ike or Chris, commoners rarely have any role in the plot, and partially due to its foundations being so linked to having good nobles who protect their people as protagonists, Fire Emblem rarely critiques nobility well, which usually causes discussions about classism to fall flat. Still, there is more to government than internal conflicts because relationships between countries are also relevant, as these are basically about who each country's allies and enemies are. For Fire Emblem typically has a point of view country, which is where the main character is from. Now, this country will often be taken over or invaded by another country, or an alliance of nations, which gives them a clear enemy. So in order to defeat the enemy, they will need to form an alliance with another country who is often much more flawed, with Etruria being classist, Brodia being too warlike, and literally everything wrong with society that you can think of exists in Benion. This leads us to the fact that sometimes a country has already formed an opinion about another nation before the start of the game, with these reasons sometimes being less than noble. For example, the Laguz nations are viewed with prejudice due to long-standing racial tensions. Ilians are looked down on for being poor mercenaries. However, usually a country's preconceived notions are based on the fact that the two have been at war for years, with the amount of nuance given to the conflict and how much each country is at fault varying from game to game, with some talking about how the former leader of the good guys' country caused their nation to suffer, and others being more black and white, still all noticeably favored the good guys' country. This leads us to the enemy nations, and one thing that I really like about how Fire Emblem handles evil nations is that even when the villain in charge is depicted as completely irredeemable, people will defect from them, showing us that the people from these nations do not all think the same way. For Fire Emblem often has the message of, in order to defeat a great evil, we must all come together, which is something that I really like, for even if there are growing pains and struggles to forgive the sins of former enemies, what remains important is for all peoples and cultures to come together and unite against a greater enemy. Speaking of peoples and cultures, it is time we move on to the next section to discuss the finer details of a country. Part 3. Culture. Culture is related to government, for if government is the big picture parts of a nation, the leaders, the conflicts countries have with each other, and the ways every country is different, then culture is about the fine details, the clothing, architecture, and the food that differentiate each country from the other. So how does Fire Emblem create different cultures? And the thing is, we have yet another case of things in this series blending together into a typical medieval fantasy aesthetic. Now, I get that a medieval aesthetic is part of Fire Emblem's MO, but there is definitely some truth to the matter that Fire Emblem doesn't differentiate cultures when they easily could have. For example, when you look at characters like Aranes, Flavia, and the words Winter Nation do not exactly come to mind. So, allow these characters to actually dress like they are from a winter nation, complete with furs and the likes. Honestly, just making each nation associated with a different color, like in Foland, would do more to create a distinct aesthetic. However, there is a reason why I picked on Fire Emblem's use of fashion, and that is because a lot of the other aspects of culture are hard to show, especially in the main story, yet that does not mean these aspects cannot be explored in other places. For example, I think Engage is the game that handles the food aspect of culture the best, and this is because the game divides every dish served in the Somniel into sections based on what country it came from, giving us a clear idea of what they eat in each country. Now, another place where aspects of culture can be found is in supports, and I think a good example of this is the Chair Chain Stall support, where they talk about the fine details of Valmy's culture, like how they scent laundry, how a girl gathering firewood with a boy is seen as romantic, and how exchanging handkerchiefs displays a deep bond between women. The problem is, supports like this are so rare that I do not even think they exist in most games. But you know what? A lot of people really like this support, and it gives the world building some great detail. However, the fine details of a nation also carry on to how the citizens of a country are written. For if leaders are part of the big picture, then peasants are the details that enrich is the world. Yet, Fire Emblem rarely puts any focus on the commoners, as the main characters tend to be lords. This is also really frustrating when you realize that one of the very few times Fire Emblem broke from this system, it really worked, as part of the reason why Ike is one of, if not the most popular Fire Emblem characters, is because he truly feels like a man of the people. In addition, the fact that most early game units tend to be knights and retainers of the main character leads peasants to feel even less important, as there is a clear ranking of how important the classes are, and it goes nobles, knights, then commoners. Yet, even if the main story is focused on lords over the peasants, that doesn't mean more focus cannot be placed on the common people in support chains. So, does this occur? Well, it depends on the game. For example, FE6 has a lot of characters, with many of the peasants having entire networks where the majority are common people, meaning a lot of the supports between these characters have nothing to do with nobles or even talk about nobility in a way that is less than flattering. On the other end, you have games like Engage in Fates, which use the retainer system, and this leads to the problem that just about every character is a noble or the retainer, a problem which is made even more noticeable by the artificial way the retainer system works, as every country has the same number of nobles, each who are given to retainers, and I think the issue might be less obvious if the retainers were more naturally spread out. This also means that if the retainers are peasants, their most important relationship will always be with their lord, and their character will always, at least to some degree, be focused around their lord. However, peasants are not just limited to playable characters, as a lot of NPCs are villagers. Now, villagers are often just there to give you advice or equipment, but how this dialogue is written can add or subtract to the world building. The most common example of bad NPC dialogue is having characters who give advice in a way that sounds like it came straight out of a game manual, rather than like dialogue an actual person would say, which can take a viewer out of the world. Less common is the fact that bad NPC dialogue can sometimes undercut certain story moments. A good example of this problem is in genealogy, as when Sigurd invades Augustria, the populace talks about how glad they are Sigurd is conquering them, which undercuts Aldigin's message of, "What are you doing conquering my kingdom, you idiot?" It is also unrealistic that anyone would celebrate being conquered, because a good 99% of the time, whoever is trying to conquer you is going to be worse. On the other hand, good dialogue can improve the story and the world. Take the Telly's duology for example, as when you enter a house in enemy territory, the villagers will scream at the player, saying you have already stolen enough from them. This tragic reaction humanizes the citizens of the enemy nation, who up until this point have primarily been known for being racist. Speaking of which, it is not uncommon for Fire Emblem to use the citizens to portray prejudice, and how well this is handled depends on the game. Fortelius tends to portray the nuances of prejudice rather well, as the game shows the different reasons people are racist, examples of unconscious bias towards other groups, and the ways in which racism is perpetuated. Yet in other cases, like in Foland or with Pan's character, discussions of racism falls flat, mostly due to bad dialogue that lacks Tellius's nuances. These marginalized groups are also some of the few who can be portrayed as vastly different from typical European cultures, probably because of the real-world history of Europeans colonizing cultures who are very different from them. For example, the people of Brigid tend to have facial markings and beads, while Sakaean outfits tend to have triangular patterns atop blue or green fabric, which comes across as quite different from the typical Western fantasy armor. Marginalized people are also more likely to have different types of government, with Sakae being broken up into tribes, and the Lagus of Gallia, Theonosis, and Kilvas choosing their king based on who is the strongest. It is also more common for marginalized cultures to be polytheistic, like how Father Sky and Mother Earth are worshipped in Sakae, or how Dusker has a pantheon of gods. This is in contrast to the usual monotheistic religions of groups who are not marginalized, which tend to have typical Christian imagery with their bishops and priestly robes. Unfortunately, though, most games tend to spend very little time in marginalized countries, with the only nation that gets adequately explored being Sakae. However, sometimes a non-marginalized nation will be influenced by a non-European country and thus look completely different from Fire Emblem's typical aesthetic. The most obvious example of this is in Fates, where there are only two main cultures, with Nar being based on the typical medieval fantasy aesthetic and Hoshido being based on Japan. This leads to a lot of differences between the two nations, including in fashion, food, and the game also divides up its classes by which country they are associated with. Fates is also amazing at showing certain aspects of culture through map design. For example, having a fight in a monastery full of apothecary pots which can heal or harm you, having a fight in a village associated with the wind, which allows you to ride the air currents through the village, or my personal favorite, having a fight in an opera house where you need to jump across gondola boats, which acts as seats for the audience. All of these places also inform the audience about what the culture is like, from the monastery showing us religious elements, to the Wind Village displaying a distinct tribal town, and the Opera House showing the importance of art, which is a really important part of culture. However, I think Fire Emblem could push this aspect of culture even farther. For example, having more fights in art galleries or libraries would allow the games to explore important literary or artistic works in a natural way. Also, Fire Emblem should make each castle look a bit different, as the gray backgrounds tend to really blend together. I mean, just having banners with a nation seal or portraits of past monarchs hung up everywhere would be a real improvement, but ideally you would have vastly different architecture. For some palaces could have marble columns, others Islamic arches, and others can be made with Chinese roofs, but as is, most are just generic fantasy palaces. Towns often can run into this problem of blending together as well, and again, you do not need to do much to make a town stand out. For example, Flora Town from Engage on paper is your typical starting town, but just adding windmills makes it stand out from every other beginning town, so a distinct aesthetic can really help, as Fire Emblem could make more mountaintop towns with houses carved into cliffs, or beach huts placed atop floating logs, or snow towns with massive igloos. For all these towns and castles are what come together to make a distinctive country. Then each country comes together into a continent, with every nation being different, but still similar, as all have a distinctive yet shared past. Part 4. History. History is everything that happened in the world prior to the start of the game. Now, needless to say, it would be impossible for the game to create a very detailed record of history, as when you just think about every major event that has happened in the past 100 years, you realize that a game just wouldn't have the time or space to replicate the nuances of history. So, how does Fire Emblem handle its history in a way that simplifies things and makes the past feel relevant to the present? Well, most Fire Emblem games have a history centered around what I will refer to as the one big event, because this incident is focused on as being an event which has a great impact on the present. For example, Henri slaying Medius, the fight against the Demon King, and him being sealed by the sacred stones, or when Alir defeats Sombron for the first time. This past often accumulates in the return of an ancient foe who needs to be defeated in this modern age. I would actually say most of these big events are well handled, as they feel important to the plot and add rather well to the world building. Yet I would say some big events are better handled than others, and this all comes down to detail. For example, the big event in Awakening is pretty clearly inspired by its FE1 counterpart, with both having an ancestor of the main character defeating a powerful dragon who brought the world to ruin by using the falchion. Now, the problem with Awakening is not that it takes ideas from Arcanea, as most Fire Emblem games do, but that the big event is noticeably weaker and less detailed than its Arcanean inspiration, for we do not even know the name of the first Exalt who killed the fell dragon Grima. On the other hand, Henri is an actual character, as he made a trek across the desert to receive the falchion from Goto before using the blade to slay Medius, and he was made into a hero by the Princess Artemis, with the two falling in love with each other, but being unable to wed because Henri was a peasant, causing Artemis to curse the Fire Emblem, saying it is the end of war and of love. Then Henri goes on to found Altea and never marries, being succeeded by his brother, who Marth descends from. Yeah, there is a reason why detail is the most important part of world building. Now, one of the easiest ways to add detail to the big event is by creating a character who experienced the big event either because they have been revived or because they are just really old. These characters make for a really easy source of exposition, as they were at the event and thus know things that the main characters aren't privy to. Multiple characters from the past also do a good job of adding different perspectives and thus more interesting ways to add exposition. For example, they can add a different perspective on humanity, which makes their dialogue more interesting to read, like Yune versus Asira in the Tellius duology, or Zane versus Goto in the Arcanea saga. However, this screen time can definitely be wasted, as there are times these characters from the past don't have anything interesting to say, which often occurs with the final bosses, who are just kind of there to act evil. This leads us into another part of the world building, which are the evil cults that these characters are often associated with. And yeah, these aren't great, as Fire Emblem tends to have its most problematic content when writing for villains, who often come across as cruel stereotypes. Now, while evil cults don't always have problematic undertones, it happens often enough that I feel I must bring this up, and the rule is if it is a desert nation who wants to summon a dark god, that is anti-Arabic, and if it is a cult of oppressed people who are actually the secret puppet masters of the world, that is anti-Semitic. Often the leader of this cult is also the one actually driving the plot, causing the final boss to feel underutilized by the story, which is kind of disappointing because a lot of these villains have super interesting pasts due to them often being responsible for the big event that shapes the game. These villains are also often Manichees, who in my opinion are one of the most iconic parts of the world building due to how well they blend into Fire Emblem's fantasy aspects, as Manichees play on the idea of the typical dragon that needs to be slain, but because of their human forms and the possibility of them being good guys, Manichees feel uniquely Fire Emblem. Now, in-game, Manichees tend to be rarer than humans, but how rare they are varies greatly from game to game. Sometimes only a handful remain, as sometimes they have their own countries. Manakeets always live longer than humans, though, and many of these manakeets have made meaningful contributions to the history of the world, like how Naga was the one who created the Falchion, how Degentia fought alongside the goddess Ashera to seal Yune and created his own country, or how Ceres defeated Nemesis. However, regrettably, none of these Manakeets are playable, and the reason why I say regrettably is because I feel like there are a lot of missed opportunities with playable Manakeets from a world-building perspective, as these characters have been alive for thousands of years. So the Manakeets could have supports talking about specific historical events they have witnessed or how the world has changed, but they rarely if ever do, as Manakeets tend to have lived in isolation before their recruitment, which is a real shame, especially because having a Manakeet's perspective on an ever-changing world could help alleviate my biggest issue with Fire Emblem history building, which is nothing much happens between the big event and the modern day, as there are often hundreds of years of history where the world just seems like it took a really long nap. Now, while it would be impossible to capture the nuances of history, there are two continents that managed to avoid this 500-year gap issue, those being Telius and Foland, with both using the same solution, as they both start by having the continent ruled by one superpower, which slowly breaks apart. This allows the countries to form slowly over time, instead of all being founded at once, right after the big event, which leads to some important history actually happening in what would usually just be the 500-year period where history seemingly went on hiatus. This then leads us into more modern times, where there tends to be what I like to call a Kickstarter event, which is an incident that causes the main conflict or war of the game. These include Garnham's betrayal of Goto, Leon's possession by the Darkstone, and the Serena's Forest massacre. Sometimes there are multiple Kickstarter events. For example, Echoes has the start of the drought and the rise of Chancellor Desai, while Free Houses has the Dusker massacre, the coup in Adrestia, the fall of multiple noble houses, along with the love of Satri and Geralt, with both of these examples coming from games with two or more character POVs, each who can focus on different Kickstarter events. Now, this can be both a blessing and a curse, as more events can make the world feel more full, but it can also spread the story too thin and make it feel like the game lacks focus. Sometimes a Kickstarter event can even encapsulate a whole or a large part of the game, with the most clear-cut example being that Part 1 of Genealogy is a setup for Celo's motivation in Part 2. I also feel the stronger Kickstarter events have two things in common. First is detail, which makes sense because the reason Genealogy's Kickstarter event is so strong and detailed is due to it encompassing the entire first half of the game. The other thing that makes for a strong Kickstarter event is if the game has what I will call a good snowball effect. This is when one event leads to a long period of strategic maneuvering and backstabbing that creates the current predicament, while causing heroes and villains alike to go through extreme emotional turmoil. I think a good example of how the snowball effect can be done right is with the Serena's Forest massacre, as Sephron's one very bad day leads to years of political scheming and puppeteering, which warps the world building of every country, and the Serena's Forest massacre is also used as a mechanism for exploring Raisin's trauma, and is why the Laguz nations declare war on Benion after finding out that the senators were behind the massacre. I also think the reason why the Serena's Forest massacre works so well is because of how good the dialogue is, as it makes the reader understand the pain of this oppressed race, and this event is able to so effectively bring to mind the atrocities committed against real-life people, and it feels like the writers have learned from history. So this brings me to one of the most important parts of writing fictional history, which is the need to understand real-world history. For in order to make good history building, you just need to add detail, but to make great history, you need to understand the source. You need to look at history and understand the reasons why things happened and be able to incorporate that information into your own story. However, the ability to do this is extremely rare and often requires years of studying history, along with a talent for writing and the creativity to incorporate that knowledge into a fictional world in interesting ways, which is a talent that few have. Yet it is a talent that one needs to strive towards if they want to create a story with amazing history and world building. Conclusion. The best way that I can illustrate what world building should feel like is by comparing it to a massive tapestry, which is woven so that its variety of vibrantly colored yarns forms a grander image. For this tapestry combines the ideas which makes a world feel unique with an execution that brings clarity. Then the finer aspects of world building, like the way governments work, the differences between nations, and the history of the world, brings in the detail that makes an awe-inspiring image unlike anything you've ever seen before. However, to create a piece this breathtaking, you must first have a deep understanding about how you need to make this art. So, to understand world building, you are required to understand the world, to understand humanity, to understand the systems which form to oppress people, the cruelty which citizens are treated with during war, and the ways in which hatred of the other has led to unfathomable atrocities. You see, there is a lot of ugliness and suffering in this world, and it takes a strong pen to be able to encapsulate this pain that humans are both the perpetrators and the victims of. For it takes a strong writer to encapsulate this cruelty that humanity seemingly refuses to let go of. Yet still, you must understand, despite all the cruelty humanity so often inflicts, that every once in a while people are capable of doing something truly good, of standing up against what is wrong and making a change, for there is beauty to be found in this world, as it is a vast place full of many different types of people. So to stave off the cruelty, we must see the beauty in other people, to see the different types of clothing people wear, the different places people live in, the different artworks people make, and so much more. Just remember, this world is a beautiful place, and it is an ugly place, and in my opinion, the purpose of world building is to say something about that. For understanding is about more than replication, it is about reflection, and the world created in a fantasy series can sometimes display that philosophy about humanity better than any speech about the state of the world ever can. Thank you for watching this video. I really worked hard on it, so I would appreciate if you could like, comment, and or subscribe. And next week I plan to release the world building video on Arcanea. So if you like this one, join me next Friday. Thank you. Bye.